Hello and welcome to Creative Intelligence. I'm your host, Kartik Hosanagar. I'm a professor at the Wharton School. I am also the faculty co-director of Wharton Human AI Research Initiative. For today's episode, I wanted to bring in a discussion I had at a live event. The event was Wharton's Global Forum. Wharton Global Forum is the Wharton School's annual conference for business leaders, and the venue always rotates. It's held in different parts of the world. And this year it was in my own backyard here in San Francisco. And I had the opportunity to moderate a discussion with multiple speakers who actually shared many different perspectives on AI. For example, there were product folks, there were engineering folks, but there were also venture capitalists on the panel. There were investors and PE investors in the panel. There was a CTO on the panel. And so this broad range of perspectives allowed me to cover broad range of topics, but multiple perspectives or lenses for the same topic. And so I thought that conversation was interesting, and which is why I want to bring it as one of the episodes of Creative Intelligence. The motivation for the conversation was manifold. On the one hand, one of the themes that I was interested in exploring is what is being called the generative AI productivity paradox. We see interest in and adoption of generative AI pretty much everywhere these days, but evidence of productivity boosts or impact on bottom line, top line isn't quite there yet. And so I wanted to explore what gives. Another theme I wanted to explore was how do we rethink how we build products in an AI or an agentic era? And again, this has many facets to it. On the one hand, there are questions of how do you as a product person adapt to ever evolving foundation models on top of which you might build your product. Also, as the surface area of the models themselves expands, they are increasingly able to do things that products that were built on top of them were able to do. And so how do you adapt to that as a product manager? And also, how do we think of moats in products when these products are built on top of foundation models and the magic is happening in a foundation model, and that model is accessible to competitors as well? Another theme I wanted to explore was how do we prepare organizations for an AI-powered future? So for example, how do you prepare teams? How do you build in organizational agility and themes like that? So there were many themes to explore and many different perspectives to benefit from. So this was a panel that I really liked, and I hope you like it too. So without further ado, let's jump right in.
Please welcome our panelists. Aparna Channapragada, Chief Product Officer at Microsoft. Sajid Jaffer, Founding Partner at GrowthCurve Capital. Xing Liu, Partner at HSG, formerly Sequoia Capital China. Ramon Richards, Chief Technology Officer at Rowe Price. Lin Yuan, Chief AI Officer and EVP of Engineering at NewFront. And one of my personal favorites, Kartik Hosanagar, the John C. Hauer Professor and Co-Faculty Director of the Wharton Human AI Research, who will moderate the discussion. It's going to be a rich and multidimensional discussion. We're thrilled to have such a powerhouse group to lead it. Welcome.
I want to actually kick off this conversation with something Vinod said yesterday, and then come to something Ethan said just a few minutes ago. So Vinod mentioned yesterday that for 80% of work, 80% of tasks for those jobs, he expects AI to completely take over those within the next 4 or 5 years. It's not a new opinion. You know, we have Sam Altman saying in President Trump's term, AGI is coming. Demis Hassabis has said by 2030, AGI is coming. Where I want to start off is perhaps look at those claims and ask, do you believe those claims, or do you think they're overhyped? And I want to start off with Aparna, you know, in your position first at Google, now at Microsoft, looking very closely at these kinds of models, their evolution. What is your take on these claims of AGI coming in the next, say, 2 to 5 years?
First of all, can you hear me? First of all, as and Ethan said, don't believe anything online. I'd say don't believe anything offline either. This is an AI avatar. No, I'm kidding. But I think to me, I think the dimension I'm looking at, again, as practical like product builders and for these organizations, is the inflection point for me is, are we going from an X% improvement? I mean, Ethan showed a few of the graphs of like 20% improvement in like coding tasks, et cetera, et cetera. The key inflection point for me is X% to X times, right? Like so then it goes from being an efficiency to more of an effectiveness and empowerment, kind of a rethink of the whole thing. So I think that's one thing. The second thing I'd say is there's no question in my mind, the part that I do agree with Vinod, although as Jackie said, he could be wrong sometimes, is that there is a clear intelligence overhang, right? Sometimes I joke saying, like, when I use some of these latest models for some very simple things, it's like we're taking flying cars to the grocery store. Like, we can do a lot better. So the thing I would say is there's an intelligence overhang. So the next few years is really going to be about all of us here building products that stretch into that intelligence.
Yeah. Maybe I'll invite Lynn into this conversation. You also are, as Chief AI Officer, deeply immersed in this space. What's your take as you see the evolution of these foundation models and as you also see how transformer models are built? Do you believe these AGI claims?
Yeah, can you hear me? So I agree with most of the points mentioned before. I think I personally have no doubt that AI is going to replace more and more tasks and workflows, even jobs, and even potentially some subsectors of some industries. But I think when we talk about the AGI, it really depends on how you define it. If we say like, okay, it's just doing some part of the work that is equivalently as good as human beings or even better than human beings, that's one side of the story. The other side of the story is like if we use a little bit more rigorous definition, maybe from the academia perspective, which is like, is there a system, are we going to see a system that has the human level cognitive abilities anytime soon? Maybe we are not very near that. I think that's due to many, many different reasons. Just from the one perspective is like when you look at how our human brain's working, it is highly, highly efficient and fascinating. And some studies show that average, like our human brain, we are just running at 20 watts. So meaning that every 24 hours, we only cost 0.48 kilowatt hour. That is just 1% of my whole home solar system generates daily. And then if you look at like what AI costs, like from the energy perspective and how expensive they are, some studies shows that nowadays, right, AI energy cost is equivalent already to some small country, and some claims that that's even more than the whole New York City's normal energy consumption, and that is just insanely high. And that is even within the context that we're probably at a very, very low penetration, very, very low adoption across many different industries. That is probably 100x more opportunities to go. And compare that with human brains, that's not like sustainable, and they'll probably need to find some alternatives. And there's many, many researches going on like nowadays.
Yeah, I appreciate that nuance. You know, there's in fact a recent paper from researchers at Apple, which is called The Illusion of Thinking. And one of the things they show in that is when you give these AI systems complex reasoning tasks and you present the problem in an unfamiliar format or you add irrelevant information, it breaks. And their point is, it's not really thinking, this is just pattern matching. And of course, to be fair, there's a critique of that paper called The Illusion of Thinking, which says that that paper is not fair and so on. But I tend to agree more with the illusion of thinking paper. So I might write a rebuttal to that called the illusion of thinking. But that's for another day. But at the same time, I think one of the things you brought up, Aparna, is it doesn't matter that it's not AGI. The fact is it's able to do a lot of things, which we do today, and will have a huge economic impact. And I think that brings me to something that we saw with Ethan's presentation. He brought up many of these studies that show 20, 30, 40% increase in productivity in these research settings. And yet you go to organizations and ask, what's the ROI? Can you measure it? Can you show it? There's nothing to really see there. is the Gen AI paradox. And so it brings up a question of what are the impediments to seeing returns from AI investments at scale? And I want to ask Sajad this question because Sajad, you're actually helping bring about this change across many organizations through your private equity focus. So tell us a bit about what you're seeing as the impediment to realizing the ROI.
So I'd make a distinction between the impediments to Gen AI successes versus traditional AI successes. If I look at my background, and I bleed Wharton red and blue, I wouldn't be here if it hadn't been for Pete Fader and Eric Bradlow's research of 25 years of models developed to predict lifetime value of a customer. Now, when I discovered those models in 2012, 2013, at the time I was developing a thesis for private equity that you can generate better returns by understanding and projecting revenue rather than focusing on just cost cutting and leverage as the basis for alpha. Not that there's anything wrong with that approach, but this was fundamentally bringing a different approach to the way how PE returns are generated. Now, when you look at the work that Pete and Eric did, and their work was also founded on other Wharton folks like David Schmidtlein, who went on to MIT, recently passed. That part of AI-driven or machine learning or statistical-based approaches to driving value creation in a private equity portfolio company, that's a foregone conclusion. It is done, and there can be no debate about it. I think the Gen AI paradox is where we are wrestling with at our firm. So now that I'm on my second startup, which is GrowthCurve, our private equity firm was founded 4 years ago, about 6 months after I sold my first company, 2.6, where Pete, Eric, Raghu, and others were advisors. Our fundamental thesis for this private equity fund, which is a Goldman Sachs spinout, is data is a latent off-balance sheet item, which means it's an asset and it's a liability at the same time. Now, when we're acquiring companies that are sitting on very large data assets and they haven't done anything with it, which, by the way, in the middle market, $50 to $150 million in revenues, is a massive TAM, and just here in the US alone. Now, the paradox is, okay, if there's all this unstructured data that you're trying to, let's say, run an example of what Ethan showed us today, the ROI is still to be determined. And so the Gen AI paradox that we caution our management teams on is continue to invest in these areas, expect problems early on, but just like previous generations of IT innovations, the solo paradox is a good example of how it can take up to a decade for those impacts to be visible in the economy. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say what you just said reminds me of the Nobel laureate Robert Solow said in the mid-'80s that you see the computer age everywhere except in the productivity stats.
Yep.
And it took roughly a decade, and in fact, Wharton, a colleague of mine, Lauren Hitt, along with Stanford's Eric Brynjolfsson, did a series of studies, and eventually by mid-'90s, they were able to show returns on IT investments. And there was a lag, as you suggested, and the issue was also that it was not just the investment in IT. You need complementary human labor, the skilling. You needed changes in workflow, and it took 10 years for all of that to happen. And so we could see something like that with Gen AI.
And that's precisely the paradox we're seeing today. So as a private equity investor, it doesn't mean we're going to be skeptical about its long-term ROI. Absolutely not. If anything, and certainly, when I look at the current cycle, I call this Nadella's law, which is the pace of computing, efficiency is doubling every 6 months, not 18 months like it did during Moore's Law's era. So you don't want to bet on that side against that innovation, but you don't want to set false expectations on your management teams on how you think about EBITDA improvement, revenue growth, cost cutting, and things like that.
Yeah, I want to invite Ramon to this because, as a CTO, you have to also talk to your CEO and CFO and justify those investments. So how are you currently looking at this question of deriving returns? What's the timeline for those returns?
Yeah, so it is a question that we are regularly wrestling with. But I do want to start with, I agree with your point that the ROI around unstructured data, it is TBD. But I think it's also clear, and this is the discussion we have with our management committee and with our board, the tools that are available today, that if we're not experimenting and if we're not investigating how to apply these to really unlock clarity on ROI, then we'll fall behind. And part of it's not just the tooling, but part of it is a shift in mindset of our employees. Part of it is knowing how to ask the right questions. So part of it is just gaining experience from pilots and proof of concepts. Early on, we have done a lot of things that are clear indicators that this is going to drive significant change in how we operate. So this feels like one of those moments where we're on the cusp of the clarity, and if we're not investing the right amount of time, again, we're going to miss an opportunity when we think about future investments ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I want to switch gears a little bit and in fact build on what you said, Ramon, which is getting into those investments and specifically getting into product development and so on. I want to invite both Aparna and Shing into this piece, maybe the first part for Aparna and then to Shing, which is, as a product leader, how do you think building software products changes because of AI? And in particular, as we are talking about even agentic considerations, what changes from a product development perspective for you?
Just about everything. And I think this is, look, I've been through the internet shift, the cloud and mobile shifts, and kind of led companies through and products through that. And I have to say, as cliched as it sounds, this time it is different, right? And there's a few things. One, the tech shift, I mean, if you think about cloud or even the mobile shift, it took like overall 15 years to kind of like diffuse, right? This is decades compressed into months, if not weeks, right? In fact, while we are speaking, I'm sure there's a new model drop somewhere that I'm missing out on. So I think that's one thing. The fact that these things, and I joke with my team saying, oh yeah, last year's magic is, this year's commodity. Like 2 years ago, if you could see what Ethan said about, oh, generated this Wharton research logo, you'd be like, get out of here. And today it's just Friday, right? And I think that's one thing that's changing. The second thing I'd say is the practical stance that I've found with our teams is really over-indexing on being model first. Mark Andreessen says software is eating the world. The model is eating the product, right? And so what I mean by that is, for example, like you saw again, Ethan, like it writes code. It reads and writes infinite amount of like data, both at the work world and the outside the world at large. So in some sense, if your product is built out of duct tape and rules and so on, and you have a lot of user experience, I would say just like start from the clean slate, put the model at the center of it. So the phrase that I generally try to say is thin product, thick model. And because, again, every year, the model's eating more of the product. The third thing I would say is the nuance. One nuance there is that in the past, we've all had to build just for humans. At the end, there's a default assumption, like whether it's productivity software or consumer software. The other end of the PC or the mobile phone, there's a human. And so one of the things, bit flips, that we all have to do is like also start to think about building for AI, building for the agents. If you're building a website, it doesn't matter for the agents, for the LLMs, what the layout is, and like whether you have Ajax or like all sorts of like fancy animations. More importantly, how much there are things that the LLMs would need for your product, right? So how do you build not just for humans, but for agents? The good news is, as I was telling Kartik behind at the backstage, this is a greenfield. It's not like anyone knows the perfect playbook or the answers. We are all kind of learning by doing. So I would strongly encourage us to kind of think about, hey, what is the model first approach here?
Yeah, so you say model first, you mentioned thin product, thick model, and that's pretty interesting. But one concern that can come up through that approach is, if all the magic is happening at the model, then is the product commoditized? Is my competitor going to build something very similar in no time? In fact, will the model itself take over the functionality of my product? So I want to ask, first, Shing, as you invest in startups, how do you think about where the moat in a product is when the approach looks like a thin product, thick model kind of approach. And then I'll come to Lynn with some variations of this.
Sure, this is a great question. I mean, we ask ourselves that question all the time. What is the moat? How can we invest in a company that is not just a model wrapper, right? I think the moat can come from multiple sources. One of them is, if you think about the data, proprietary data, and also dynamic data, not static. And I'll give you some examples. For example, in autonomous driving, for example, if you have hundreds of thousands of cars out there running every day, and so you give you the data advantages, and it's not only proprietary, but it's also dynamic. And think about another example. Let's say hypothetically you want to develop a educational sort of application to serve as the coach to a kid when covers the age from 3 to 30, let's say. And so if you are the real companion to that kid or that family, and you know along the way, you collect all the data, right? And then so it's hard for other apps to disrupt you once you accumulated so much data. You know your client so much better. So I think the data is certainly one area that you can develop moats. Second area is that we look at this a lot, is to how do you integrate the power of AI with hardware, robots, for example, humanoids, or other type of smart devices, where you have the cross-disciplinary integration of software and hardware. That can potentially give you an edge against the foundation model companies who are mostly working on the software side. And last but not least, I think it's very, very important as an investor. Yesterday, Vinod talked about this also. When you want to change the world, it's super, super important to have that one person who can instigate change, right? Who has the tenacity and the vision. And so as a venture capital investor, we are always out there looking for that person that has the superpower. And I think that founder, entrepreneur, can be different from a big organization like OpenAI or Anthropic. So we look for those type of outlier entrepreneurs who himself or herself is the moat of the company.
I wanted to add one. I love what you said about the data and the nuance there. And I think it relates to two other things that we're seeing kind of in product building, right? So one is, when I say thin product, thick model, you also want to start to think about user experience as a feedback into the model, right? So based on how your users are interacting with your products, often that is the reinforcement learning feedback into the model. That's one way to uniquely build something that a broad one-size-fits-all doesn't. And then the second thing is memory is a moat, right? If to your point about the educational companion app, the longer you are able to build a meaningful, useful relationship through your product with the user, over time, then much higher switching costs. And I think again, with the model plus this memory, you're going to have a much better time kind of relying on the suggestions and recommendations from that particular product versus a generic thing that's more like a 50 first dates, right?
Yeah, no, I like the idea of data as a moat, especially this idea that the human interaction, the data from the human use with reinforcement learning as a big feedback loop, and that's great. I want to just double click on the data piece, and Lynn, I want to explore that with you, and especially I want to explore it in the context of vertical use cases. And you are in the insurance world and looking at, how do you bring AI innovations in the insurance space. Just a few minutes ago, Ethan was talking about how these large general purpose models, their capability set is so broad, and larger model, more data, scales really well. And he talked about how Bloomberg GPT did better than GPT 3.5, but then GPT 4 with larger model, larger data set takes over. I still think there's a unique space for vertical solutions, bringing in data from that world and building vertical smaller models. I want to explore that with you and get your take on, would you just use the general models out there, or what are the situations where you would think about maybe building custom models or a different approach to the standard general large models out there?
Yeah. So as someone who spent a lot of time on building AI applications and AI agents, we love to see the model competition. feels like come more. Like every week we see the new things, more powerful, higher performance, cheaper. And for us, we just want to use whatever we can use to basically build the products that increase our revenue and also lower the bottom line. Now, obviously, the cost perspective, the lower, the better. And then on the cost perspective, I think there are definitely many opportunities in different verticals. And we all touched on the data point. It's not always that the giants own all of the data for all of the industries, right? And then the reality is many established business, many established organizations in certain industry verticals own their proprietary data, very, very specific to a type of industry, very specific to some type of tasks. And then there are numerous opportunities for these industry verticals to develop their own model. I think that's like healthcare, like finance, and insurance. In the insurance world, we are like an over century, maybe over 2 century old industry. And in the past, before Gen AI, we're always like, yeah, so much data there, but they're all dirty data because that's not the standard. It's all sitting on PDFs. It's all like different insurance companies, different carriers create their own terminologies, sometimes referring even to the same thing. And it's very hard to make some structured data mining from it. But LM models definitely unlock a lot of opportunities there. And then industries like us, like insurance, like healthcare, it's also very highly regulated industry. I was in DC before with some other industry representatives talking with the lawmakers about the industries and the regulations. And then for us, insurance is a little bit special because it's not just highly regulated, but we are dealing with 50 different state level regulations, like how lucky we are, right? And then you need a lot of expertise or subject matter expertise in this specific industry to understand, okay, where you can unlock the value with maybe vertical specific models, or maybe with like a very special, as mentioned before, like product interactions. And quite often when we look at the agents in this industry, chatbot wrapper is definitely not good enough because like insurance, a very, very simple example. It requires a licensed person to perform certain tasks. And how do you design like the human interaction in terms of intervention, like correction, et cetera, like it's all very, very different. And when we look at those aspects, it's like, do we want to use very expensive, very costly general purpose models to tackle certain tasks, even though it's also very good at another 100 different tasks, right? Do we want to pick, let's say, either like use your high quality data to build some smaller, more cost-friendly models that are even better on specific tasks, or you also have opportunities. You have high quality data, you can pick not the most optimal model, smaller, cheaper, open source to perform fine-tuning on top of that to gain very, very good results on the specific task. So I still see that there's lots of opportunities there.
I think one fantastic point. I think this is what we are seeing, by the way, even with Microsoft. And one of the things we are seeing with our customers is how it's a multi-round game. Meaning a lot of the customers are starting with the baseline models, right, and then baseline infrastructure from Azure or maybe other providers. And then what they do, the second round is kind of the fine-tuning with their specific data, with their specific kind of like advantage. And then there's also the post-training, meaning that, hey, now when you're building these vertical agents for, say, claim processing or for email triage or whatever, then you kind of almost cut a slice through the whole thing. You take the most baseline model, you then adapt it to fine-tuning it to your customers so that it thinks like your business, talks like your business, even terminology and acronyms, and then hopefully like works like your business. To your point about the stakes are higher when you're taking action versus just read-only. So when you're taking action, you want a lot more of the fine-tuned vertical knowledge.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to give a very small example of vertical model. Let's say I mentioned about robots, right? Let's say robots operate in a very harsh natural environment. and with limited energy resources. I mean, it's impossible that you can run a big model on the cloud. You have to have something very specific.
Yeah, good examples. I think those are all good arguments. And I'm in that camp, which is that there are many situations where you don't want to use these large models and pay all that money when you can build something custom.
Yeah, it's the sophistication that's coming, right? So I think right now, I talked to a number of CIOs from other companies. There's so much focus on identifying the right use cases, exploring with kind of the larger models that are out there today. I think as we start evolving and understanding what are the right answers depending on the type of use cases and get sharper in terms of the use cases that are applicable and that will benefit from AI, to me the next step is, all right, let's get really smart about what is the right model to use, because quickly cost and really maximizing the ROI is the important focus.
Yeah. I want to take the conversation in a slightly different directions, and also for all of you, if you have questions for our panel, you can start entering it in the app in about 10 minutes or so. I'll move to the Q&A as well. I want to switch the conversation into a slightly different direction. One, which is very business-centric, but a couple which are a little more around organization, design, and things like that. And so the business-centric question for Sajad, because you are spending a lot of time looking at the private market space and looking at AI investments across a large portfolio of companies. What are you seeing there in terms of what's working, what's not? And especially, I feel like the private market space is one ahead and also very nimble in terms of how aggressively it's pursuing AI-enabled change.
Yeah, so when I started 2.6 in 2012, our view was that there's been no technological innovation in private equity since the Microsoft Excel spreadsheet. And the view was, okay.
Hey, it's still good.
Right, and what could we... And I was an ex-Microsoft Excel product manager, so the question was, okay, what can we in the private markets learn from the quants in the public markets? And the thinking was, it starts with data. And when I look at the 8 years when I had 2.6, when we analyzed $160 billion worth of granular receipt-level transaction data applicable to commercial diligence, it was a very, very hard problem to solve for. Over those 8 years, it came down to one word, culture. And so when we were starting out at GrowthCurve, I was thinking about if Vista were to start from scratch, and their playbook is legendary in the private markets, and let's say they only focused on data, what would that data first playbook look like? And what's really neat about this panel is you'll notice that we haven't talked much about AI. We're talking a lot about the raw data that fuels these companies, which is the latent asset and therefore the latent liability. That's the off-balance sheet item discussion we're having. And we see a playbook that starts with the CEO first and the board. And it pains me to see how private equity boards waste management teams' time focusing on things that just don't matter. And so the key opportunity, there are many, many opportunities in the private markets to bring AI and data first. But the cultural shift that we are advocating for starts with, A, what defines a data-first CEO? And there are a handful of CEOs I've interacted with during my time who at first sight again say, this is a data-first CEO. We want to work with this partner to lead our companies. Now, if that's the CEO part, the other part is us, private equity board members. What's our data-first cultural orientation as well? And I think there also there's a massive shift occurring in a sense of self-awareness within the private markets. It's really time for us to also shape up our game as well. And we can talk a lot more about examples of where that is happening. So that's sort of how I see the AI private markets play.
So on the culture piece, and especially at a time where the change is so rapid, I'm curious, and I'll pose this to Ramon, which is, the question is, how do you approach the rapid change? How do you even make a plan going forward when the landscape around you is changing that rapidly? And what's the posture you take as a technology leader in the organization when you do that?
Yeah, I will tell you, in my 27 years in technology, I haven't seen a technology advance as rapidly as the focus on generative AI. But we also start with, we have to protect the company first. And so over the last 2 years, while enthusiasm is growing, and within our company, we have a long list of use cases and opportunities across every part of the company. We focus on security, data privacy, consumer protection, so some of the non-functional requirements, the right governance, the right controls that you have to have in place. But you then have to create the space for the innovation. And we also don't have unlimited capacity that we can point to this. So prioritization matters as well. And so that is a regular point of contention. And then the other part of it is, how do you prepare the organization for the change? So exploring the technology and finding really good opportunities is just one part. There is a shift in mindset. There is a change in our workflow and our processes, and how do we support these new capabilities that we're putting in place. So we are not losing sight of the controls to protect the company. We are creating a lot of space for innovation and experimentation and rolling out products. And we're focusing more and more time around how do we get our company ready for what we think is going to be significant change driven by Gen AI.
Yeah, maybe one last question before we go to audience Q&A. And it's a question that I've been thinking about because there's some implications to business education as well, but it's probably broader implications for organization design and so on, which is the statement, for example, Sam Altman made, was it a year ago or 1.5 years ago, whenever, which is, it's a matter of time before we see a one-person unicorn. And especially with agentic approaches, we're talking about very lean organizations now. And we're talking about maybe organizations with 5, 10 people accomplishing what extremely large organizations would do. So the question that comes up for me is, when we teach, organization behavior, people management, there's a certain model of the corporation that we have when we teach all those kinds of things. Is that all outdated now at this point? Is my question, and I'll pose it to Xing.
It's not yet outdated, but it's pretty soon going to be outdated. I think both gentlemen talked about how existing large organizations or larger organizations cope with the speed of change that generative AI brought. But as a venture capital investor, I think we are looking forward to the new type of company, if you will. Maybe it's just one person, maybe it's 3 person. It's not just a company. I think, looking at what Ethan did, in his presentation, I think hypothetically that could be a one professor business school. when you can have the digital Ethan 1, digital Ethan 2, digital Ethan 3, and you have the robots, you have the agents, whether it's digital or physical, it's possible. So I think as a Wharton grad, I worry about Wharton's curriculum. And how are we going to teach? Because in the future organization, one-man company, if you still call them a company, it's interaction between agent and human, and agent could be digital and could be physical, and then it's interaction between agent, and then of course you still have some human-to-human interactions. So how do you organize these, and what does leadership mean? What does teamwork mean? Also, a recent trend that we've increasingly seen more and more common these days is startups are, on day one, they are global teams. They have someone in China, they have someone in Silicon Valley, there's someone in Paris, or maybe in Northern Europe, in Australia. 5 people in 5 different time zones working together and using the Gen AI tools and models to create a product or services. And I think all these creates lots of new challenges.
I think a couple of new opportunities too. In fact, I think a lot of the agent interactions, like I feel like every employee in the future will have to become a manager on day one. They have to manage these team of agents, right? And turns out you have to kind of like direct them, get work out of them, and so on. So a lot of the organizational behavior communication work may have to just extend to non-human employees too.
And
right?
also, what does performance measurement mean, right? What is incentive? What's the incentive scheme? What's the incentive structure?
And forget 997, it's 24/7, right? And I think
Maybe one of the new job skills we require in the future is how to manage agents.
So I'm going to switch to a Q&A now. I'll start with a question I see here, which is, from your perspective, how should AI native startups compete or partner with incumbents like Microsoft and NVIDIA? And I'd like to even generalize that and ask, how do companies think about who to partner with and where startups might fit into that equation? I'll start with Aparna, the Microsoft perspective, and maybe I'll also love to bring in Ramon in terms of T-Rowe's perspective on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, first of all, I would say, like, just even taking my Microsoft hat off, I think this is such a green field that I think if the cliche in the past was, oh, that is something that Google would do or Microsoft would do, I would critically evaluate that, because it's such a green field. Everything is getting relitigated. Having said that, there are three things I would say. So one, look at where you can be complementary in terms of large scaling versus solving. So I think if you're an AI native company, one of the best things you can do is look at a problem that needs to be solved, really maniacally focus on that with that like 1-person team, 3-person team, and then use a lot of like AI tools. And then where you want to scale, that's when many of the hyperscalers are great. Like Microsoft is a great partner. We're focused on a few areas. We're not kind of like trying to build a robot as well as like a whole bunch of things. So I think especially on the cloud and enterprise side, that's a great way to do that. That's number one. So solve versus scale. I think the second one that I've seen, at least our customers, even the AI native startups, is the productivity tools. So one of the things I'm excited about is, Excel's amazing, but if you think about what Ethan showed this morning, and what Shing is saying about, hey, if you have this global team of 5 people with like 500 agents, what is the new productivity set of tools you need? So imagine an AI that's actually in your group chats, in your emails, in your kind of, and saying, look, in the background, it kind of makes the entire 5-person team as productive as if you had like 500 people. So that's another area. That's a plug from my area to kind of say, like, work with us to figure out what the new productivity tools would be. And then the third thing is goes back to what Lynn was saying, which is the look at where you can get data, and not just data out in the world, not just proprietary data, but I think one of the key untapped pieces of data is what's in people's heads. The latent process knowledge that a lot of folks have is not expressed fully as a feed into the intelligence. So I would maniacally focus on that.
By the way, we have... Okay, go ahead. We'll keep it quick, but I see some great questions coming in. I want to squeeze as many of them in, but if you don't mind a quick answer.
So we work closely with our hyperscalers on the advancements they're making, but we also spend a lot of time with startups. And the startups that are the most interesting are the ones that really understand asset management, some of the problems that we are challenged by. The way we scale our innovation is by finding the right startups that can help advance in areas where we may not be as focused. So I see a lot of opportunity.
Great, thank you. There's an interesting question which we haven't touched upon, but I think this could be, you could have a whole thesis on this, which is what regional or global dynamics are shaping the ecosystem?
Yeah.
I'll maybe ask Shing to kick off that conversation, because obviously US-China is a big piece of it.
Yeah, I think, Jensen Huang said 50% of the AI talents are Chinese, but most of them are actually in the United States. I think from what we can see today, I think the AI development, certainly US and China are leading the rest of the world. However, I would say, when DeepSeek, for example, earlier this year open sourced its model, I thought that was quite a defining moment, because that, it's not so much as it demonstrates the capabilities of the Chinese AI companies, but I think it's more about providing model accessibility to everyone in the world. And so that I think that would unleash more and more, especially application developers. They can come from anywhere. from Stockholm in Sweden, from somewhere in Australia. I think the talent and also the model that we talk about, that the small teams that they can be very dispersed around the world. I think despite of the China, U.S. sort of a rivalry when it comes to AI, advancement, I think there will be more global teams, using the AI powers through open source, through other talent collaboration, and propel the frontiers of the AI technology.
Yeah, I think
we see it similarly too, because look, the supply chain physical world rivalry that we've been talking about is completely nonsensical in the world of AI, because you're talking about 7 to 8 billion brains around the world that could be connected, building software, data, and processes. And the network that we have been building as a globe over the last 30 years or so, you can't put that back in the bottle. And so we're the Global Business Forum over here, and Wharton really led the globalization path. It's impossible to talk about a world. There's no end game over here, in other words, right? There's no us versus them. The more data and knowledge each individual produces around the globe, everyone is benefiting from it. So we don't see that rivalry the way the media wants us to believe.
Yeah. I, for one, even with the US-centric lens, actually cheer what DeepSeek did, because I think it's showing us, even with GPU constraints, you can innovate post-training and things like that to
and if they've deflated the cost, let's say by 90%, if you're a private equity investor, why would you not want to play that trade every day?
Yeah. Another question here from Jen, which is, how is generative AI reshaping what top talent looks like in your organizations? And what should MBAs be learning or unlearning to stay relevant? Anyone has a strong view on this?
Pretty spicy view.
Yeah, please.
I think Vinod said it yesterday. Previously, I think the gatekeeping was around intelligence, right? Like, how good are you at these skills and so on. Turns out everyone has that smart coworker in their pocket, right? So what are the new set of skills? I would say 3 things. So first spicy one is around computer science and AI fluency. I wouldn't say you don't have to go and do an operating systems class, although you should, it's a fun one. But I think it is one where you need AI fluency. Regardless of what role you're in, you're instantly 3x more valuable. Second, I would say this back to our managing agents. How do you actually communicate? How do you direct work? How do you actually say, hey, if you have 500 agents and X amount of GPUs, that's going to be your resources. You're not going to just get a PC. You're going to get this stuff. So how do you start to say, get work out of those resources? And then I think the third one is the global point of view, right? Which is how do you connect the pieces, connect the dots across the company, across the world, and just being that posture.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, I think about it, from my perspective as a professor, I kind of think at this point, that kind of expertise and knowledge is commoditized now. And so I have to think about what's the constraint now. If knowledge is easily accessible, to me, it seems like the constraint now is motivation, inspiration. And so that's kind of where I have to focus as a professor, which is on the inspiration, motivation, and getting people excited about a topic because the information is so easily accessible.
And agency too, I think the ambition and agency, because these models can do a lot more than what we ask today.
I say that maybe Lynn and then Xing. Yeah.
A little perspective on that. I think just coming from the engineering perspective, I think people who are more creative and more adaptive will win, because we all know there's so many for example, vibe coding tools nowadays. It significantly lower the barrier of becoming an engineer, and also it's breaking the barrier between the past jobs we call you are a front-end engineer, a back-end engineer, you are a DevOps engineer, a data engineer, etc., etc. Nowadays, when we talk about a potential one-person unicorn company, it's basically one person can be more and more versatile than before. And then also when we say that the best AI agents or applications will be built by the text experts and also subject matter experts, right? And then those skills and those knowledge and those experiences can also be converging more and more to the same group of people in the future.
Okay. Xing?
Yeah, the point I was going to add is that in organization, I think at times like this, it requires people who are a little bit more risk-taking, or courage is the word that Vinod also talked about yesterday. I think you cannot overthink about always analyzing the problem. You got to do something, right? You got to hit a roll and get actions going. And I think right now in organizations, if you are thinking about how can I make an impact, how can I secure my job, or even right from a more defensive side, I think you just need to act on.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that I think educational institutions in general and business schools in particular really have to go back to the basics and ask questions from first principles in terms of what's relevant, what should we be teaching, and so on.
And I have a first principle, which is it's not the school that makes the student, it's the student that makes the school. So I'd ask myself, what am I going to contribute to Wharton given the resources and the research that happens here that will make this, a formidable organization? And I think when you flip that argument, then the way we approach education, right, it just changes. So we don't appeal to, what Pat Harker, he was the dean when I was a student, he gave a great talk on credentialism over substance. That if you're going to approach the school for the purposes of a credential, then arguably you've lost the game.
Yeah. One question here from Samuel, which is, to Mr. Liu's point, a model that has worked with a client for a length of time becomes locked in as a result of having more data on the client. What governance structures need to be implemented to ensure data is portable to enable competition? So it's really, maybe Lynn and Ramon, how do you think about preventing lock-in when you're dating each of these foundation models and bringing your data to them?
Yeah, I can start. So that has been front and center for us over the last 2 years. And a lot of models that we leverage them within our firewall. And so we have a lot of proprietary research data that we're applying the models to, but the data cannot leave our firewall. We have a lot of client data that we've applied the models to as well. We are exploring where we feel comfortable allowing data outside of that firewall, but that is a risk that we regularly think about.
Normally, like in our industry, for example, we have different tiers of data sensitivity, right? And then even like we own ton of client data. There are insurance documents, there are claims, there are employee information, work compensation and claims, and all kinds of stuff like that. And then some of them are just more sensitive than the others. So when we design products, when we design AI-powered process, AI-powered agents, and we need to be very mindful of where we put which kind of data in. And also when we try to design the applications, we try to make the architecture more and more like agnostic to models so that we have the opportunity to switch in between. And then nowadays, like even we try or experiment some new ideas, we just ask the team to try different models, right? Like when we run hackathons or we run some like brainstormings together, and we just hands-on experiment the ideas and we try different models. And then, in the future, you always have opportunities to switch because, like I said before, like every week, every month, we just see more powerful models coming up, and then we just see more and more smaller, but potentially also performing better and less cost models in verticals. Those like changes are just happening too fast, and it's going to be a very high cost for us to be really locked in.
Okay. One last theme I want to explore with you all before we wrap up in the limited time available is the societal implications of AI. We've talked a lot about the business pieces. There's no doubt there's a lot of productivity coming our way, a lot of value creation coming our way, but it's also pretty clear that AI is going to shift the surplus away from labor to capital. You're going to have superstar firms. You're going to have a narrow set of people having ownership in that. So how should we think about, having those gains be more evenly distributed? And we're not seeing companies raising their hand And it's not clear they're supposed to either, but we can debate that. We're not seeing companies raising their hand and saying this is our approach in terms of how we make sure AI creates value for all. I'm not seeing from governments any clear proposals in this regard, and nobody's trying to get ahead of the problem. So what's the solution? Because we could easily be in a situation where there's all this value created, but a lot of people are miserable because you don't have jobs, or you don't have things to do, there's mental health issues, all kinds of potential problems that we might need to tackle. I wonder if any of you have any closing brief remarks on this theme.
That's a tough question to try to end on an optimistic note. I do think we're in a transitional period that I think for the next several years, maybe up to 10 years, there's a lot that has to be figured out. I think there is a period a lot of companies recognize where there is an advantage to moving fast, and there is a benefit that you'll gain that over the next 5 to 10 years will just be the new norm. I think through that, what are the new roles that will matter? What are the skills that we should invest in? What is the right way to govern it? How quickly this technology is evolving? I think we're figuring it out, but those big things are trailing the pace in which the technology is evolving. And so I think the fact that it's trailing, and I don't see it catching up, is going to be what creates just a lot of tension that we have to work through until we kind of settle on it.
Have a more optimistic note, which is I think there is no question that there is going to be dislocation, right? And people have talked about this an analogy to the farming thing where from 40% I think it went to 3% of GDP, and there's a big dislocation, and it's not an abstract thing, it's people's lives. I do think there's a couple things that are on the horizon. So one, there will be entirely new job categories and jobs created. So for example, as you have these very, very intelligent AI systems, you still need the last mile verification. You still need a last mile operation. So yes, it will be a different kind of job. Like we didn't have a social media manager in mid-90s or a graphic designer in early 90s. So I do believe that there'll be a new set of job categories. Now, they may not have the same demand, right? Actually, we are seeing that in computer science and coding as well, right? Like there's, for the first time, I think there's a little bit of a glut of new graduates in CS. And with vibe coding, with coding assistants and so on, it'll just be, there's a market dynamic that'll play itself out. But I strongly believe that there'll be a entirely new rebundling, as Ethan called it, of new tasks, new jobs, new categories.
Yeah, Lynn, last comment, I guess.
Well, one problem, very quickly, one problem we do see that while AI creates so many opportunities, there is actually a very, very risky risk management perspective there. And many, many examples, but one simple one is professional liability. And professional liability in the insurance world, from the underwriting perspective, is not really catching up with what is happening nowadays quickly enough, but I think it will. Maybe slowly, maybe faster, we don't know yet. And then when we create all of the things and surface the products and services to clients, it just put a very small disclaimer on AI can make mistakes. Please check important info. We will never be good enough. And then we will probably see many, many problems around that very soon.
Yeah, I think these are great perspectives. I think where I land is similar to Aparna, which is in terms of where we'll eventually end up, I'm very optimistic that, probably 70, 80% of the work we all do, there's a lot of grunt work which is taken away. That time that's saved up, that is an opportunity for us to move up the Maslow's hierarchy towards self-actualization and all of that. And that's the opportunity, but I think the challenge for us is we're going to go there really fast, and the journey there's going to be a lot of bloodshed is what I fear, and so there's a lot of work to be done. I think this has been a fascinating discussion. One last question I have for you all is from a friend of mine, and the friend's question is based on the kinds of themes we've been talking about, which is, do you believe at the next global forum, AI will have taken over the moderator's job, or will still have a moderator? Anyway, I'm being facetious. I think it's been a fascinating discussion. I want to make sure we end on time. I want to sincerely thank our panelists for flying from wherever all of you have flown in to make this happen, so thank you so much.
Well, I certainly enjoyed moderating that discussion, and I hope you found that interesting as well. There are a few different takeaways for me from this conversation. I'm going to first start with the discussion I had with Sajat, where both of us mentioned a famous quote from economist Robert Solow in 1987, when he mentioned that you can see the computer age everywhere except in the productivity statistics. And interestingly, as I mentioned, by the mid to late 90s, research by many of my colleagues in information systems helped show that indeed investments in IT, indeed investments in computer software did help increase organizational productivity. But we saw that boost many years later. There was a lag. And the reason for the lag was that the software alone wasn't enough. You needed to have complementary resources like skilled labor, redesigned workflows, and so on. I think generative AI will be very similar. I think we're in very early stages of workflow redesign, of certainly reskilling. And so I suspect those productivity benefits are likely 5-10 years away, is what I think. The other insight that I do take away from that conversation is from Xing, where he posed the question of what does leadership and teamwork mean in an AI or in an agentic era? And he brought up how future teams could be human agent teams, or it could be agent teams, and also that the humans in these teams may be fewer, or the human teams may be leaner in a sense. And so there are many implications for organizations. Certainly for me as an educator, we have to ask, what does it mean to teach our students things like leadership or organization design or organization management principles. Ramon also brought up some interesting points in terms of how do we build in organizational agility, and especially why that is the new role of the CIO or CTO as well. We also had a discussion on what it means to build products in an AI era. Aparna and Lynn both talked about this, and they emphasized a model-first approach to building products. And that I thought was quite interesting, that you first and foremost think about the model's capability set, where it's going, and make that front and center in your product design. It may also mean redesigning interfaces. For example, we're starting to see an interest in an emphasis for chat-based interfaces, and might that become more of a norm? Now, of course, chat-based interfaces might feel more natural to many of us because, of course, chat works great and we can also use voice with it. But also, is there possibility of a pushback on chat-based interfaces when we are so used to other interfaces for software like your CRM, your Salesforce software completely redesigned where you interact with it, you add entries, you read everything all through chat is radically different. And I wonder also whether there might be a pushback of this change happening very fast. So many interesting themes to explore here. I hope you enjoyed that discussion and it helped create some food for thought. I would love to hear your thoughts and perspectives. Please share your comments on social media or on this very platform. And of course, not only do I love hearing your perspectives, but also your suggestions on topics to cover in future episodes and things like that. So please keep those comments coming. Once again, thank you for joining another episode of Creative Intelligence. I'm your host, Kartik Hosanagar, and see you next time.